So this week my journey with the Speeduino is continuing. I'm starting to get closer to the finish line. All I've really got to do is solder everything into the breakout board that I got from Rusty FI, and then from there I can connect that back into the Speeduino, and I should be ready to run, save for a few couple details like the O2 sensor and running the line to my intake manifold for the map sensor, but I'm almost there. Nothing in life is perfect, of course, so I did run into a few issues in this process, and you'll see that in the video. So follow along and I'll show you guys exactly where I'm at. So I ordered this breakout board from Rusty FI to just kind of simplify the remainder of the process. So I'm going to basically pop this connector in there and solder it, and then I'll solder to the different points here leading back to my Speeduino connector, and that will serve as the adapter in between. So first, let's pop these pins in. Only goes on one way. Now I took some screws off the factory connector and board that I had so that I could bolt this down. So there's some little holes here that are for that, and that kind of, having that bolted down just makes it easier for you to then solder all this stuff. It kind of sucks that like they covered the little screws with solder for whatever idiotic reason. Made them a real needless pain in the butt to take out. I didn't have a way of cleanly desoldering them either, so putting them in sucks too. I only was able to harvest 2, even though there was 3 on there. The other one got jacked up, so just is what it is. Gotta take what you get. This is pretty nice. Easy enough, I think, to follow the pin layout and know what goes to what. See if I can... Nah, I'm gonna have to properly desolder this stupid screw because the head is coated in solder. Okay, so going through this project absolutely necessitated my getting a soldering iron. I had a soldering iron before, but it's not on a proper soldering station, so it's not very well controlled. It's just one you plug into the wall, like an old school one from Radio Shack that I had lying around. So I went and acquired a proper soldering station with a tip cleaner. I've got some brand new solder. I'm going to go ahead and solder my connector into my breakout board, and then from there I'll be able to work on getting all the wires tapped into the breakout board. Still do have to figure out what I'm going to do mounting wise for the connector side of the ECU housing, but for now I'm just going to go ahead and solder all this up. See if we can't get this soldered out. Some solder on here. Warm the pin. And there we go. There's one. Kind of going carefully one by one, getting all these pins soldered in. Oops. Knock some excess solder out of there. Looks like we're going along pretty well, so I'll just keep doing that for a while. Tin this, hit some solder on the pin, down, kind of direct the solder down into the hole. And I'll keep going along doing that little by little. I did have a little excess blob in one spot here that I kind of want to reduce. That looks better. So I'll just keep doing that and get it all soldered up. So here's a map of my ECU and what it connects out to. So I've kind of gone through this based off what Garrett gave me and highlighted basically everything that I need to connect to. So I'm going to go off this and what I did in Pinouts, and that's going to help me figure out what to solder into my breakout board in order to basically get the Speeduino connected to and speaking to all of the Tacoma's factory electronics. I've basically created this massive file in Excel that just has like the pin mapping, and I went through all the Toyota documentation, determined what each one of those pins does on the Toyota ECU as much as I could figure out, and then started mapping those to what they should connect to on the Speeduino and what those pins are for. Okay, so if we look at this board from Rossi FI, basically like I soldered the Toyota connector into it, right? So this is the 26, this is the 16, and this is the 22 pin connectors portions, right? Now the upper row of pins, right, runs out this way and goes to the bottom. The lower row of pins runs out and goes to the intersection here. So that means that if you start, let's say from this pin here, that corresponds to this point here. The same thing here, this is actually your number 1, right? It's this pin right here, the number 1 on the connector, corresponds to here. But the one directly under it corresponds to here. Now the way these are labeled, because the top is actually on this bottom row, then this says 3A, then the one beneath it is 3B, then 3C, 3D, right? E, F, G, H, etc. So it kind of zigzags up and down, right? Top row, bottom row, top row, bottom row. Same thing there. This is section 2 according to Rossi FI, and this is section 1 according to Rossi FI. And it follows the same exact layout. Then it's easy to tell by the way things are labeled which of these corresponding holes align, right, to the pin that you want. And that makes breaking this out really easy. So one thing to consider is right now, I've not really created a mounting scheme for this to work in here. So that's going to be a little bit of a consideration. I have to figure out what bracket I'm going to create, and obviously it's going to have to loop, right? Like we'll have to go between the Excel. We'll have to go between this existing screw here and the opening on the Rossi FI board. Same thing on the opposite end, and that's how I'm going to hold it in place. Obviously I want to kind of bring it as forward as I can, as far forward as I can. So I'm going to go ahead and assemble this box and then lay everything out to see where I'm going to cut my wires before I do anything else. So sitting this here, got the Speeduino fully built into the housing. This connector is going to sit somewhere in this region, and I need these cables to come up to it. And realistically, they're all far longer than they need to be. What I need to make sure is, right, take a cable from the far end here, right, and make sure that it can reach the farthest possible point on the breakout board, and then that length gives me more than enough for every single cable to reach whatever it needs to reach, so I can cut every cable there to that same exact dimension because everything else is closer. And then the idea is I don't just want it to reach, right? I want to be able to add a loop at the end, and that little loop is just for strain relief. So I'm going to do that, and let's see, this is fully mounted, and I really wish for this to be able to go a little forward, right, because I really want this to hang somewhere there. And then I want this cable to be able to reach right there, have a loop. So this is plenty of cable. I can cut every single cable down to the length of this one with its loop, and that will be plenty. So I don't have to have so much length of cable everywhere. But for now, let's go ahead and cut every cable. I will mark this where I want to cut it. Right, and it still gives me extra in case. Just give me plenty of slack. And straighten it out. And we're going to cut all these cables to about that same length. Same length as that one, so that it all is shorter and more manageable. I'll start with, I'll go row by row. And actually, I'll take this apart first. So random thought, but if I were going to do this again, and I plan to actually build a few more of these for other Toyota Tacoma people, but knowing what I know now, right, one thing I would do quite differently is I would not pay the extra money to have this connector put on here, and the reason for that is that I could have just put the wire straight into the board and soldered them, and then I wouldn't have to figure out packaging for this, because when this part of the connector's on, this little upper part is interfering with the lid, so I'm going to end up having to grind this little upper part off of there. So it's just a food for thought for anyone else thinking of doing this. You may not want that connector if you're trying to build into an OEM ECU housing, just because it takes up room that you may not have or may not want to spend on that. That being said, it is nice to be able to quick disconnect my Speeduino and transfer it to something else if I wanted to, right? Like, say I build another one for my Miata, and I just wanted to test everything before I commit, blah, blah, blah. Boom, just pop this one out, put it in there, throw a base map, see how it works. Anywho, let's go ahead and cut this out to length. So I'm going to separate these out row by row so that it's as straightforward as possible to cut. Do the same now for all the other rows. I've got my breakout board sitting inside the housing now. In order to really get it to fit, I had to cut down a little bit here and here, just trim it down with a cut-off wheel on my Dremel. And I'm going to design some brackets, right, that are going to jump between this screw hole and this screw hole in order to bolt it down. But first I want to really do all this soldering stuff, so I already took the measurements for designing those brackets. I've got this guy here, and man, even at the length that I left these cables, I think they're going to be too long. I mean, granted. So basically I've just made this chart. It gives me my Speeduino pin number and colors, its designation, the actual function, then the corresponding Toyota pin, right, and the Russ EFI breakout board equivalent. For the purposes of this, I don't even need to know the function. I really just need to know Speeduino pin to Russ EFI. So I can even hide this. Alright, so this is all I need. Really, the Speeduino and the Russ EFI breakout equivalent. So the general gist here is I'll take a pin. Number 5 goes to the 2A on here. So section of this is number 5 up top. Start counting from the top left. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I also know because it's one of the only orange cables on here. So it goes to, we said, 2A. So it goes in the center. It goes here. This is gonna suck because I'm gonna be like putting the cables through and then soldering. And one thing is, I said that I want to loop the ends of my cables. Alright, so I kind of want to loop like that, and that's just gonna like act as a strain relief on the end of the cable. So let's pop that into 2A. There's a few different slots I could use for 2A, but you know, I might actually use the front slot. This is a little bit more difficult than I thought it would be. There we go. It's a little bit prettier. I really gotta get a magnifying glass in here. When I'm done, I'll obviously cut all these pins down. Right, so that's one done. Now I just have, let's see here. Yay, 43 more to go. Fun times. Alright, next one. I'll keep doing that, and I'll be done soon, hopefully. So I've got a few wires soldered in, and I kept the loop on all of them for strain relief. I'll be hot gluing the other end, just to kind of help hold it all together. Now, this kind of shows you the importance of mapping this stuff out before you get to pinning a connector up or whatever, because now I have all these excess cables that I'm not even going to use. And who knows, I may find uses for them in the future, but for right now I'm not going to use them, and they're everywhere, and I don't have a easy way to unpin this thing. So for future reference, if you're doing something like this, figure out the mapping of the pins first before you clip anything into a connector. It'll make your life so much easier. And again, more reason why this would have been good to just do soldering to the board instead of using that connector. Be much less stuff that I'd have to consider. But yeah, it's going along pretty decent. I'm admittedly not the best at soldering to this, but I'm getting a little bit better as I go, and the flux base is definitely helping. So I'm going to keep chugging along as long as my eyes will tolerate. I really got to get a magnifying glass to do this, but I'll keep going and see where we end up tonight. So something that I've been struggling with in this process is getting a wire through these holes cleanly without like strands breaking off. So what I discovered is, first, and this I was doing from the beginning, was twisting the wires clockwise, right? My hand's going clockwise. And then I was trying to twist the wires into the holes clockwise. And then I would always have a fiber, a string or two that would stick out. But I realized that if you just go counterclockwise, it sinks in smoothly and none of the strands stick out. So that's what I'm going to be doing for the rest of this process in order to get this done nicely. So just to show you guys really quickly the soldering technique that I found most effective in this whole like putting wires inside this board. So the first mistake I made was I was using the wrong soldering tip. You want to use an angled flat tip like this one that can really distribute the heat throughout the entire tip of the wire. Now you want to use flux. Flux is going to make your life so much better. So we'll go ahead and we'll take our flux syringe. Comes a nice handy dandy little syringe, and we'll put some flux here. Right, so this is obviously not my breakout board nor my Speeduino. This is just a little board just to illustrate the concept. I have these little spare boards. Right, so I did that. And now it's covered in that flux. And I'll come with my soldering iron. Nice clean tip. Pop it up here. Let that flux kind of start to boil. Bang. And there you go. Nicely soldered in. The hole completely filled up. Right, nice, smooth, clean job. My breakout board did not initially look like that. However, I practiced and then I went back on all the ugly ones and tapped them with this tip, and that greatly improved the finish of that board. So, that being said, I've gone ahead and finished soldering all of these things, including this, not the prettiest, but I basically soldered, this is supposed to go to chassis ground, And because this is going to be mounted into the metal frame of the ECU housing, then I just added this here, and I'll add a little connection off into the metal, and then my chassis ground will be happening. There's a bunch of other grounds on the boards. I've put a little loop on the ends of the cables just as strain relief. I'm going to do that to all of them. And then I'm probably going to add hot glue, but for now I'm not doing that, and the reason is that there are still some functions kind of left on the table here that I haven't used. Now, I may go ahead and do the hot glue anyway, because I don't think I'm going to use those functions through the breakout board. They're going to have their own bulkhead, if I'm being honest. And that's for a clutch input, which my Tacoma does not get a clutch input to the ECU. The way that it keeps you from turning the truck on when you step on the clutch is just a sensor. Is it not even a sensor? It's really a switch, right? When you push the clutch, in, it pushes in this little kind of like tab on this little sensor and little switch, and that is what allows you to turn the car on. I canceled that out anyway, so I'm gonna run that into the Speeduino, but that's gonna have to connect elsewhere, not to my breakout board, so that I can then have the signal for launch control through the clutch. And then I'm also gonna get a flex fuel sensor. That's a future state thing. So I'm definitely going to have to run a wire for the flex fuel sensor. And then there's other things I may want. So I'm basically going to buy like a 4-pin bulkhead connector and build that into the ECU. But for now, this is everything I need to get this thing started. So we're going to go with that. And later we'll do other things. There's so many other inputs and outputs I can use. There's a bunch of low current outputs still left here. There's general purpose input and output, which is these white cables. I basically have a ton of unused wires, which is not going to be fun to package into the ECU. So I'm actually going to try and figure out how I can depin the connector and eliminate every single one of the unused cables, because I don't want to have to package this inside. In order to reduce the amount of wires in the ECU housing, I've wrapped whatever wires I did want to keep for future additional things, features that I might want to add in the future, like boost. But all the excess ones I depinned, and in order to do that, basically look at this connector, and you will stick a depinning tool like this into the upper slot, pop it in, and then you can yank on the cable from the back and the pin pops out. Now the rubber seal in the back makes it really difficult. Sometimes the pin gets stuck and the wire pulls out. I really hate this connector, and in retrospect, like, I would never buy one with this connector again. As a matter of fact, I have a half mind to buy another Speeduino without it, cut all these wires out of here, and just solder them into the other Speeduino, then buy another one of these goofball connectors and do a setup for the Miata using the Speeduino I already have, just because I have enough experience and I'll figure out my cables and know what order to go in so I can make the goofy connector work. But it'd be so much easier to just not deal with it and just solder directly into the Speeduino. I didn't want to have to solder wires in the Speeduino. I wanted to quick disconnect everything, so that's why I did what I did. But I do ever so slightly regret it. So for a future application, I definitely won't be going with this connector. That's one thing that I'm absolutely going to axe. You can save money there by not having to deal with it, and it just makes everything better, simpler, less complex. It's just another point of potential failures. And then moving the rubber seal, like, I gashed through some of the cables, so hopefully the rubber seal will protect them. It's a disaster. I'm not happy with it. So I made these adapters to bolt my breakout board onto my housing. I'm pretty happy with them. Holds it nice and rigid. Keeps it exactly where I want it to be as far as the connector goes. So at this point, I can literally bolt my Speeduino into that housing and ready to roll. I'll tuck all these wires up. The ones that I immediately do plan to use, for example, like the clutch input for launch control and the E85, those I'm going to connect into a bulkhead, and I'll go from there. But for now, this is ready to rock. I've got to fit the Speeduino and get a flexible tube to use for my map sensor input from the fitting, the brass fitting into the Speeduino. And that's pretty much that. At that point, I just got to do some wiring on the O2 sensor and run the line for the map to the intake manifold, then I can literally connect this thing into the truck and get going. So next episode I'll be installing the firmware and doing the setup on the Speeduino, and hopefully I can borrow a base map from somebody so that I can get that started. But if not, I guess I'll have to build my own base map and we'll see how that goes. I also intend to seal off a little bit of excess around here by kind of like covering this and pouring epoxy in the corners, and of course here where this is, I'm going to 3D print a little piece that goes around this and seals it off, just so I'm not getting dust inside this box. So I want this box to basically be as sealed as it can be, within reason. Obviously I'm not going to waterproof it, but I want it to just be, you know, dust free, and you know, be able to just kind of test it, get it up and running. Once it's running and I'm happy with it, then maybe, you know, I'll seal it a little more tightly. But the OEM one wasn't watertight either. It was literally just bolted together, and you know, there's a little metal plate touches up to here, and the other plate touched on the top, and that kept it, you know, from getting any dust inside, which is really what you don't want. Another thing I gotta do is I gotta go get alcohol tomorrow, isopropyl alcohol, so I can clean all of this off because it has all that flux paste. So I definitely gotta get that flux paste off of that, clean it off so it doesn't cause any, you know, oxidation and issues in the future. But that is where I'm at as of this week. I'm super happy that I'm basically nearing the finish line, so hopefully next week's video I'll at least have this in the truck and be running preliminary tests, if not blatantly having it running if I'm lucky. So if you guys are entertained, you're following along, you like this kind of content, feel free to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so that you're notified when I post up another one. If you have any questions, feel free to leave that in the comments section. And as always, thank you guys for watching.